Bonjour, ici Irvin Studin. I'm president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, editor-in-chief and publisher of Global Brief magazine, chair of the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids Post-Pandemic.
Irvin, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and the TFE community today. You've got a new book. It's titled Canada Must Think for Itself, and that for me raises a lot of questions. Firstly, what do you mean by that? And what are we doing now if not thinking for ourselves? And what has to change in Canada in that respect?
Despite the fact that we're a highly educated society, I think one of the most educated pre-pandemic in the world, and despite the fact that I'm extremely proud of being Canadian, as are you, and therefore I would urge all listeners around the world and across Canada not to be insulted when I say Canada must think for itself. We are born a very distinctly colonial society. The Constitution Act 1867 says that Canada will conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. So we are, despite the mythology we have in our pedagogy, in our heads, in our public discourse, we are born as an annex to the British Empire. After the Second World War, we migrate to the American Empire. We remain within the American Empire, an extension of American power, at a time when American power is increasingly unimpressive. British power is very marginal, and we're surrounded by great powers on all sides, and we've been collapsed across the systems during the pandemic, and we cannot muster the intellectual fortitude to understand our circumstances and exit. Moreover, thinking is not, as I argue in the book, just saying, well, I have a good thought or I've reflected. It is really a function of the work that you put in as a country to build a scaffolding on top of which you can work. So you're not going to think at the level of France or Germany or now higher Russia, United States, China, all of these countries that are not that much bigger, but that have a lot of scaffolding that we don't have, just by saying, oh, I have an idea. You need to build it, and then we'll get to a higher level of thinking that we need in our country to master our circumstances and pressures coming out of the pandemic and in this century.
Those are very macro, high level issues and very interesting questions that you raise. I think you drill deeper in the book into what you posit as the 10 theses, or your 10 theses that will define Canada's survival and success in the 21st century. Could you briefly outline what those theses are and maybe underline those you think might be most important for Canadian competitiveness and success and sustainability in the future economy?
The first thesis is that we come out of the pandemic with six, maybe seven national systems crises. I mean, systems crises. And some of those crises are obviously public health, but that's the minor crisis. We have a massive economic crisis, which we can discuss, historical education crisis, which is, by the way, global. It's much bigger in other countries, but it is huge here. We have an institutional crisis. We have a national unity crisis. We have a crisis of international weakness. And we have a growing social crisis in the country. So 6 or 7 crisis of systems, the first thesis. The second thesis now gets to our circumstances, which we talked about in your first question. We are not interested only in the American border, as we keep telling ourselves. And we're not only interested in what Washington says or what the American media say. We're actually surrounded by geographically great powers on all sides. We have China to the west, we have Russia to the north, right across the melting Arctic, and we still have Europe there. So ACRE is our power game: America, China, Russia, Europe, and Canada finds itself right in the middle, and we have to negotiate these great pulls and pressures. So thesis 2 is very interesting, I think. Thesis 3 goes to the point that if we survive these wicked circumstances, we'll actually come out a major power ourselves. On the other hand, we may not survive, and that failure or non-survival could obtain very quickly. We could disintegrate as a country in the next 5 or 10 years. Or we would end up a vassal state, a deep vassal state, which is, by the way, our current condition. We are a vassal state to the United States, formally and intellectually. And it is a vassal condition that I find increasingly insufferable and that doesn't advance us in our national interest. The fourth thesis, and I'll go through a few of the other ones, suggests that Canada could become the center of the world through the north, through the Arctic. It's very much an economic proposition, starting economics. And is that if we imagine that we have the biggest unprotected border, although closed now, with the United States, the biggest market in the world, still barely. Through the north, we actually can position ourselves, if we have enough imagination, as the center of an international market of 2 billion people, including Northeast Asia, Eurasia, and the former Soviet space, Russia, Northern Europe, and continental North America. Those are four continents grinding atop the North on Canadian geography. And if we master it and we make ourselves the center of the world, we can, through very great advantages of geographical proximity, have regular flights through the North, regular cultural business exchange, obviously economic and production exchange, environmental exchange through the North. So the imagination must go up, and then you understand that Whitehorse is closer to Shanghai than is Sydney, Australia, and Inuvik is closer to St. Petersburg than is Toronto, and so on. In that spirit, I also talk in another thesis about Canada having a population of 100 million by the end of the century. It's not that impressive if you look from the outside, because Canada's the second biggest country in the world. We're huge. But 100 million is necessary not as an immigration proposition, but as an economic proposition, as a human energy proposition. Canada, coming out of the pandemic, is de-energized. We just don't have enough people to have the right markets, the right production, the right infrastructure, and that is amplified, that crisis of demography, as you go further north, where we need more and more people. Climate change oblige. So you imagine the north of the country has a territory the size of the European Union, but it has a population the size of Ajax, Ontario, or Trois-Rivières, 115,000 people, and we need to populate increasingly further north. And at 100 million, it'll be a little more comfortable as a demographic and economic proposition for Canada. A few other things I would argue: that we need to better control our information space. We talked about why we don't think for ourselves. Well, everything is controlled today by social media, including Canadian media, which filter through social media. And if you imagine all the social media, Facebook and Twitter, are run out of algorithms formed in California, that means we can't tell our own stories, we can't muster our own vocabulary, we can't even correct our own mistakes of public policy and public administration. So that also is part of the project of thinking for ourselves. And there are others as well.
If I had to put you on the spot, I know that you told me in our introduction that all of these contribute to our success or not in the future economy. Are there any that rise to the top that you would highlight as being the most important to tackle as soon as possible?
Let me put it this way: the core economic crisis of Canada coming out of the pandemic is the massive destruction of Canadian business. 100,000, several 100,000 Canadian businesses of all description, not just the restaurant section and the tourism sector, which were the jewels of Canadiana. Toronto alone had 5 Chinatowns, 2 Little Italies, 2 Little Indias, and so on, in Montreal, Paris. But manufacturing and transportation, uh, this is huge Canadian capital, human capital, wealth, networks, supply chain, all destroyed within a year. I don't want to talk about the genesis of the destruction, but it is tragicomic and it is historical. So that is the basic crisis. Now, we are not going to get out of that economic crisis or that an economic catastrophe simply by changing tax rules or having small investment or waiting for the restaurant sector to zombie back into existence. That's not going to happen, and that's not the way the logic of economics works. So we are out of a calamity. We need to reimagine the next space in a sustainable way, as you say. There are three things that ideological boxes that we need to uh, évincer, as we say in French. We need to destroy in order to unleash human and economic energy in Canada. First, they're called the 3 C's of Canadian poverty. If we overcome them, we can become grand and rich and prosperous and dynamic. The first C is COVID. That is, we cannot allow our society to settle into a low energy equilibrium that is a COVID lifestyle, where we're zombieing around and doing protocols, everything defensive, while everything disintegrates, and the dynamic countries and populations of the world build, and we're still in the COVID low equilibrium. So we must surmount that quickly. I do not believe in a gradual exit. It's got to be high energy, and we move on. The second C that we need to overcome is China. China is not a moral concept, it's not a monster. It is the most important country of this century and the most important country coming out of the pandemic. And it is the most important in all terms, and starting obviously with the economy. It just so happens that it's very close to us. So we need an equal to equal partnership and relationship with China across the spheres, and we must realize that it will come with its disagreements, but it is a long-term proposition that we would be foolish to imagine didn't exist. The third and final C is climate change, and notwithstanding, and with great respect to what's happening in Scotland as we record this interview, I do not see the Canadian climate change proposition as imagining that our economy alone will be changing the profile of the climate. The major Canadian strategic and economic response to climate change is to say what's happening in the world and Canada and what's our sweet play. And what's happening is that objectively our north is opening up, and that is a real estate that, as mentioned, is as big as the European Union alone. And there is nothing we can do in policy, and there's nothing the world can do in policy to refreeze that opening up. It is an objective fact. We open it up, we master it, and we become the masters of both our own geography and the world, economically to begin with, but in all the other senses as well.
You've already given me so much. I want to ask for 30 seconds more, if you don't mind. And that's for your pitch. I want to see who you would pitch, a person or a group that you think has the power to really increase the competitiveness of Canada's future economy. Who would you pitch and what would you urge them to do right now?
For the young people, I hope this will be extremely exciting. I'm talking now to them. Open up, dream, get working. Do not let anybody zombie you to sleep. Zombie condition is death, and we need energy. We need more people also, by the way. We can attract the best and brightest around the world. We still have an attractive proposition to make. But tomorrow can be very, very sunny, but it requires, as I say to my students and to my kids, work, work, work.